Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her helmet one last time as she climbed into the cockpit of her F-16 Fighting Falcon. The morning sun painted the airbase in golden hues, but there was tension in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. At 26 years old, Sarah looked more like a college student than a fighter pilot. Her small frame and quiet demeanor had earned her skeptical looks from fellow pilots since her first day at the squadron. The other pilots called her bookworm because she spent her free time reading technical manuals instead of hanging out at the officers' club. They saw her perfect test scores and assumed she was all theory, no real flying skills. What they didn't know was that Sarah had grown up flying crop dusters on her family's farm in Iowa. She had been handling aircraft since she was 14, developing an instinctive feel for flying that no classroom could teach. Her squadron commander, Colonel Martinez, had his doubts too. During training exercises, Sarah flew by the book, never taking risks, never showing the aggressive edge that made great fighter pilots. She followed orders perfectly, but never impressed anyone with flashy maneuvers or bold tactics. Her fellow pilots respected her technical knowledge but questioned whether she had what it took when things got real. The briefing that morning was routine. Intelligence reports suggested enemy activity in the northern sector, but it was expected to be a standard patrol mission. Sarah would be flying wingman to Captain Rodriguez, a veteran pilot with 12 years of experience. As they walked to their aircraft, Rodriguez gave her the usual advice about staying close and following his lead. Sarah nodded quietly, checking her equipment one more time. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency over the controls, running through pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. The ground crew had learned to trust her thoroughness. While other pilots might rush through preparations, Sarah never skipped a step. Her aircraft was always in perfect condition, her weapons systems calibrated to perfection. As her engine roared to life, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came over her in the cockpit. This was where she belonged, where all the noise and doubt from the outside world faded away. The radio crackled with tower communications as the flight prepared for takeoff. Rodriguez's voice came through her headset, confirming their flight plan and reminding her to maintain radio discipline. The takeoff was smooth, and soon they were climbing into the clear morning sky. Below them, the landscape rolled away in patches of green and brown. Sarah maintained perfect formation with Rodriguez, staying exactly where a good wingman should be. Everything seemed normal, just another routine patrol over friendly territory. But 20 minutes into the flight, their radar screen suddenly lit up with multiple contacts approaching from the north. The calm morning was about to become something entirely different. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio, sharp with sudden alertness. 6 enemy fighters were heading straight for their position, flying in tight formation and moving fast. Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but her hands remained steady on the controls. All those hours of training, all the technical knowledge she had absorbed suddenly clicked into place. The farm girl who had learned to fly by feel, the student who had mastered every manual, and the quiet pilot who had been underestimated were about to become something her squadron had never seen before. The radio exploded with chatter as command confirmed the enemy contacts. Rules of engagement were transmitted rapidly. Rodriguez began calling out tactical positions, his voice tense but controlled. Sarah acknowledged each transmission with crisp, professional responses. But inside, something was changing. The careful, by-the-book pilot was giving way to something deeper, more instinctive. As the enemy fighters closed distance, Sarah's training took over completely. Her hands moved across the controls with fluid precision, checking weapon systems, adjusting radar settings, preparing for what was coming. She had run this scenario 100 times in simulators, but this was different. This was real. And everything she was about to do would matter in ways that training never could. The morning sun was still shining, but the peaceful patrol had just become a test that would reveal who Sarah Chen really was. The enemy fighters appeared as 6 dark specks on the horizon, growing larger by the second. Rodriguez immediately called for backup, but command informed them that the nearest friendly aircraft were 15 minutes away. They were on their own against overwhelming odds. Sarah could hear the tension in Rodriguez's voice as he outlined their defensive strategy. But something inside her was calculating different possibilities. "Stay tight on my wing, bookworm," Rodriguez commanded. "We'll try to break their formation and buy time until help arrives." Sarah acknowledged the order, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead, analyzing the enemy's approach pattern, their formation spacing, and the terrain below. Years of studying aerial combat tactics were combining with her natural flying instincts in ways she had never experienced before. The enemy fighters were flying in a classic attack formation, 2 pairs leading with 2 more trailing behind. It was textbook aggressive tactics, designed to overwhelm defenders through coordinated assault. Most pilots would have followed Rodriguez's defensive plan, but Sarah saw something else entirely. She saw 6 individual aircraft with predictable flight patterns, each one vulnerable if approached from the right angle. As the distance closed to weapons range, Rodriguez began the first defensive maneuver, a sharp climbing turn designed to force the enemy to overshoot. Sarah followed initially, but as the enemy fighters committed to their attack run, she made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing the defensive pattern, she broke formation and dove toward the lead enemy aircraft. "Chen, what are you doing? Get back in formation," Rodriguez shouted over the radio. But Sarah was already committed to her attack run, her F-16 screaming downward at maximum speed. The enemy pilots focused on Rodriguez's aircraft didn't immediately notice the threat diving from above. Sarah's first missile locked onto the lead fighter just as he realized his danger. The Sidewinder missile streaked from Sarah's aircraft with a trail of white smoke. The enemy pilot tried to evade, throwing his fighter into a desperate barrel roll, but Sarah had calculated the intercept perfectly. The explosion lit up the morning sky as the first enemy aircraft disintegrated in a ball of fire and debris. Rodriguez watched in amazement as his quiet wingman had just scored her first kill. But Sarah wasn't finished. As the enemy formation scattered in confusion, she was already lining up her second shot. The trailing fighters had broken left and right, exactly as she had predicted. Her aircraft banked hard to the right, G-forces pressing her into her seat as she pursued the nearest target. Her training told her to climb for altitude and reassess, but her instincts were driving her forward into the chaos. The second enemy pilot was more experienced, immediately recognizing the threat and turning to engage Sarah directly. What followed was a classic dogfight. 2 fighters circling each other in a deadly dance of thrust and maneuver. Sarah's aircraft twisted through the sky, pulling Gs that would have made her instructors nervous, but she felt completely in control. Her opponent was skilled, but Sarah had advantages he couldn't see. Growing up flying agricultural aircraft had taught her to handle her plane at the edge of its performance envelope. She knew exactly how much stress her F-16 could take, how tight she could turn, how hard she could pull without losing control. The enemy pilot was flying well, but Sarah was flying with an intuitive understanding that went beyond training. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. Sarah maneuvered her opponent into a climbing turn that bled his airspeed, then dropped behind him for a perfect guns kill. Her 20mm cannon fired a short burst, and the second enemy fighter joined the first in a smoking dive toward the ground below. Rodriguez was still calling her name over the radio, but Sarah's attention was already shifting to the remaining 4 enemies. The tactical situation had changed completely. What had started as a 6 against 2 disadvantage was now 4 against 2, and the enemy pilots were no longer confident in their attack. Sarah could see them regrouping, trying to figure out what had just happened to their formation. They had expected to face standard defensive tactics, not an aggressive pilot who fought like she had nothing to lose. Sarah climbed for altitude, checking her fuel and weapon status. She still had 4 missiles and plenty of cannon ammunition. More importantly, she could feel that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The careful, methodical pilot who had always played it safe was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the best defense was an overwhelming attack. Rodriguez formed up beside her, his voice crackling over the radio with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Nice shooting, Chen, but there are still 4 of them. We need to stay defensive until backup arrives." Sarah acknowledged his transmission, but her eyes were already locked onto the remaining enemy fighters. The morning that had started as a routine patrol was becoming something none of them would ever forget. The 4 remaining enemy fighters had regrouped into 2 pairs, now approaching more cautiously after witnessing their lead aircraft destroyed. Sarah could see their hesitation in their flight patterns. They were no longer dealing with what they expected to be an easy target. The confident attack formation had been replaced by wary maneuvering as they tried to assess this new threat. Rodriguez called out tactical positions over the radio, his voice steadier now that backup was on the way. 2 bogeys at 11 o'clock high, 2 more at 2 o'clock low. They're trying to bracket us. Sarah acknowledged the transmission, but her mind was working on a completely different level. She wasn't just reacting to the enemy's moves anymore. She was anticipating them, seeing patterns they hadn't even formed yet. The lead pair of enemy fighters began a diving attack from the left, while the second pair climbed for altitude on the right. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to force the defenders into an impossible choice. Engage one pair and leave yourself vulnerable to the other. Most pilots would have called for evasive maneuvers trying to escape the trap. Sarah saw it as an opportunity. "Rodriguez, break right and climb," Sarah commanded, her voice calm and confident. "Draw the high pair away from me." Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, unused to taking orders from his wingman, but something in Sarah's tone convinced him to follow her lead. As he climbed toward the right-hand pair, Sarah rolled her F-16 inverted and dove straight toward the attacking aircraft on the left. What happened next defied conventional fighter tactics. Instead of engaging in a traditional dogfight, Sarah used her aircraft's superior maneuverability to position herself between the two enemy fighters. They were forced to break their attack formation to avoid colliding with each other, giving Sarah the split-second advantage she needed. Her third missile fired at point-blank range, striking the trailing aircraft before the pilot could react. The explosion was so close that debris from the destroyed fighter rattled against Sarah's canopy, but she was already turning hard left, using the confusion to line up on the remaining aircraft from the attacking pair. The enemy pilot was experienced and dangerous. Realizing he was alone against an opponent who had just destroyed 3 of his wingmen, he immediately went defensive, throwing his fighter into a series of violent maneuvers designed to break Sarah's targeting lock. But Sarah had grown up flying in all kinds of weather, learning to handle aircraft when conditions were far from perfect. Turbulence and unpredictable flight patterns were nothing new to her. She stayed with him through a series of barrel rolls and split S maneuvers that would have tested any pilot's limits. Her F-16 responded to her touch like an extension of her own body, following his every move with precision that seemed almost supernatural. The enemy pilot was skilled, but Sarah was operating on pure instinct now, her conscious mind barely involved in the process. The 4th kill came when the enemy pilot made a critical error. Trying to gain altitude for another attack run, he pulled into a climb that left him momentarily vulnerable. Sarah's cannon found its mark with a short, precise burst. The enemy fighter rolled over and began its final dive toward the earth below. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio, filled with amazement. "Chen, where did you learn to fly like that?" But Sarah didn't have time to answer. The remaining 2 enemy fighters had broken off their attack on Rodriguez and were now diving toward her position with obvious desperation. They had watched 4 of their squadron mates fall in less than 10 minutes, and they knew they were facing something extraordinary. Sarah climbed for altitude, checking her weapons status. 2 missiles remaining plus her cannon. The enemy fighters were approaching fast, flying in tight formation as if they could protect each other through proximity. But Sarah could see the fear in their flying now, the slight hesitation that came from facing an opponent who had shattered their confidence, the farm girl who had learned to fly by watching. The wind patterns over Iowa wheat fields was about to teach 2 experienced enemy pilots why confidence mattered more than experience. The quiet student who had memorized every technical manual was combining book knowledge with instinctive flying skills in ways that no training program could have prepared her for. As the final 2 enemy fighters closed to weapons range, Sarah felt a calm settle over her that she had never experienced before. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about proving something to herself and everyone who had ever doubted whether she belonged in a fighter cockpit. The next few minutes would determine not just who lived or died, but who Sarah Chen really was as a pilot. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, and the peaceful patrol that had started less than an hour ago was about to reach its stunning conclusion. The final 2 enemy fighters approached with the desperation of pilots who knew they were facing something beyond their experience. Sarah could read their fear in the way they flew, slightly off their optimal attack angles, their formation just loose enough to show their uncertainty. These were veteran pilots who had probably never lost 4 wingmen in a single engagement. Their confidence was shattered, and Sarah intended to use that to her advantage. Rodriguez had climbed to a safe altitude and was providing tactical updates over the radio. 2 bogeys approaching from the northwest, speed 450 knots, altitude Angels 15. His voice carried a new respect that hadn't been there an hour ago. The quiet wingman he had been protecting was now clearly the dominant fighter in the engagement. Sarah banked her F-16 into a climbing turn, using the sun to mask her position. It was an old trick she had learned from reading historical accounts of World War II dogfights, but the physics hadn't changed. The enemy pilots would have trouble tracking her with the bright morning sun directly behind her aircraft. Every advantage mattered when facing two opponents simultaneously. The lead enemy fighter broke left while his wingman continued straight, trying to force Sarah to choose between targets. It was a sound tactical decision, but Sarah had already anticipated the maneuver. Instead of committing to either target, she rolled into a diving turn that brought her below both aircraft, using their own separation against them. Her fifth missile streaked upward toward the fighter that had continued straight ahead. The pilot saw the threat and tried to evade, but Sarah had fired from an angle that gave him limited escape options. The missile tracked true, and the explosion sent pieces of the enemy aircraft tumbling through the clear morning air. 5 down, 1 to go. The final enemy pilot was alone now, facing an opponent who had methodically destroyed his entire squadron, but instead of retreating, he turned toward Sarah with the aggression of someone who had nothing left to lose. This would be a straight fight, pilot against pilot with no wingman to complicate the equation. What followed was the kind of dogfight that pilots talked about in hushed tones years later. Both aircraft twisted through the sky in a deadly spiral, each pilot trying to gain the advantage through superior positioning and flying skill. The enemy pilot was experienced and dangerous, throwing his fighter through maneuvers that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their limits. Sarah matched him turn for turn, her F-16 responding to her controls with precision that seemed to defy physics. The two aircraft climbed and dove, rolled and turned, locked in a dance that would end only when one pilot made a fatal mistake. G-forces pressed both pilots deep into their seats as they fought for position in the three-dimensional chess game of aerial combat. The enemy pilot was skilled, but Sarah had advantages he couldn't understand. Years of flying in turbulent weather had taught her to read air currents instinctively. She could feel the slight changes in pressure that told her when her opponent was about to turn, the tiny variations in engine sound that revealed when he was pushing his aircraft beyond its optimal performance range. The fight lasted nearly 5 minutes, both pilots burning fuel and ammunition as they maneuvered for position. Sarah's cannon fired twice, missing by inches as the enemy pilot threw his aircraft into defensive spirals. His return fire came equally close, cannon rounds tracing past Sarah's cockpit with deadly precision. The decisive moment came when the enemy pilot attempted a vertical climb, hoping to use his aircraft's power-to-weight ratio to gain altitude advantage. But Sarah had been waiting for exactly this maneuver. Instead of following him up, she rolled inverted and dove, using gravity to build speed before pulling into a climbing turn that brought her up behind his aircraft. Her final missile fired at close range, the infrared seeker locking onto the enemy's hot exhaust. The pilot saw the launch and tried desperately to evade, but he was at the wrong altitude and airspeed for effective defensive maneuvering. The explosion lit up the sky as the sixth and final enemy fighter disintegrated in a ball of fire. Sarah pulled her F-16 into a climbing turn, checking her instruments as the debris from the final enemy aircraft fell toward the earth below. Her fuel was running low and she had only cannon ammunition remaining, but the immediate threat was over. 6 enemy fighters had approached that morning expecting an easy victory. Instead, they had encountered something they weren't prepared for. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, filled with amazement and respect. "Splash 6, Chen, all targets destroyed. Command, this is Rodriguez. Threat eliminated. Returning to base." Sarah acknowledged the transmission with her characteristic calm professionalism, but inside, she was processing what had just happened. The quiet pilot who had been underestimated by everyone in her squadron had just achieved something remarkable. In less than 20 minutes, she had destroyed 6 enemy aircraft in single combat, displaying flying skills that would be talked about for years to come. But as she turned toward home base, Sarah wasn't thinking about glory or recognition. She was thinking about the lessons her father had taught her about flying, and how sometimes the most important battles are the ones where you discover who you really are. The flight back to base was surreal for Sarah. 25 minutes earlier, she had been following Rodriguez on what seemed like a routine patrol. Now she was returning as the pilot who had single-handedly destroyed 6 enemy fighters in the most spectacular air-to-air combat engagement in recent memory. The radio chatter from command and other aircraft in the area buzzed with excitement and disbelief. Rodriguez flew close formation beside her, occasionally glancing over at her cockpit as if he couldn't quite believe what he had witnessed. During the flight home, he shared details of the engagement with command, his voice carrying amazement as he described Sarah's tactical decisions and flying skills. She didn't just react to their moves, he reported. She was 3 steps ahead of them the entire time. As they approached the airbase, Sarah could see crowds gathering on the flight line. Word had already spread about the engagement, and everyone from mechanics to senior officers was waiting to see the pilot who had achieved the impossible. Sarah felt a familiar nervousness building in her stomach. She had always preferred the quiet anonymity of being underestimated to the spotlight of attention. The landing was perfect, Sarah's F-16 touching down smoothly despite the emotional intensity of the previous hour. As she taxied toward the hangar, she could see Colonel Martinez standing with a group of senior officers, their faces showing a mixture of pride and amazement. The ground crew that had prepared her aircraft that morning now looked at her with something approaching awe. Sarah shut down her engines and went through her post-flight checklist with the same methodical precision she always used. Her hands weren't shaking. Her voice was steady when she communicated with the ground crew. But inside, she was beginning to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. 6 enemy pilots had died that morning, and she was responsible for all of it. As she climbed down from her cockpit, the reality of combat began to sink in. This wasn't a training exercise or a simulator run. Real people had been in those aircraft, pilots with families and friends who would never see them again. Sarah had always known that being a fighter pilot meant being prepared to take lives, but experiencing it firsthand was different from any training scenario. Colonel Martinez approached her with a smile that mixed pride with amazement. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant Chen. That was the most extraordinary display of air-to-air combat I've seen in 20 years of service." Sarah saluted crisply and responded with her characteristic professionalism, but she could see the questions in his eyes. Everyone wanted to know how the quiet, by-the-book pilot had suddenly become a combat ace. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. Intelligence officers wanted every detail of the engagement, from tactical decisions to weapon performance. Sarah answered each question clearly and accurately, but she struggled to explain the intuitive aspects of her flying. How could she describe the way she had felt the enemy's intentions through tiny changes in their flight patterns? How could she explain the instinctive knowledge that had guided her decisions? Rodriguez provided his perspective as well, describing how Sarah had taken command of the engagement despite being the junior pilot. "She saw opportunities I missed," he admitted. "Her tactical awareness was beyond anything I've encountered." The intelligence officers scribbled notes furiously, trying to capture lessons that could be incorporated into future training programs. As news of the engagement spread throughout the base, Sarah found herself dealing with something she had never experienced before: celebrity. Pilots who had barely acknowledged her existence suddenly wanted to buy her drinks and hear her story. Mechanics asked for autographs. Junior officers looked at her with the kind of respect usually reserved for squadron commanders. But the attention that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Major Patricia Williams, the only other female fighter pilot on the base, approached Sarah after the debriefing. Williams was a legend herself, one of the first women to fly combat missions, and Sarah had always admired her from a distance. "I've been flying fighters for 15 years, Williams said quietly. "What you did today was special. Not just the tactical success, but the way you handled yourself under pressure. You've shown everyone that skill and determination matter more than size or volume." Her words carried weight that went beyond military recognition. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters trying to process the day's events. The base was buzzing with celebration, but she needed quiet time to think about what had changed. The pilot who had awakened that morning worried about proving herself had ended the day as one of the most respected fighters in the squadron. But with the recognition came new pressures. Everyone would be watching her now, expecting her to perform at the same extraordinary level in every mission. The comfortable anonymity of being underestimated was gone forever, replaced by expectations that might be impossible to meet consistently. As Sarah prepared for sleep, she thought about her father's words from years ago when she had first expressed interest in flying fighters. "The sky doesn't care if you're big or small, loud or quiet," he had said. "It only cares if you can fly." Today, she had proven that she could do more than just fly. She had proven that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones nobody sees coming. 3 days after the engagement, Sarah's life had completely transformed. The Pentagon had classified the mission details, but word had leaked through military channels about the pilot who had achieved 6 kills in a single engagement. Fighter squadrons around the world were requesting copies of the combat footage to study her tactics. Aviation magazines were calling for interviews, and military historians were comparing her achievement to legendary aces from previous wars. The immediate aftermath brought a whirlwind of meetings with senior officers, tactical analysts, and training instructors who wanted to understand how she had accomplished what seemed impossible. Sarah found herself explaining her thought processes to generals who had decades more experience, but who recognized that she had demonstrated something extraordinary under pressure. Colonel Martinez called her into his office for a private conversation about her future. "The Air Force wants to fast-track your promotion," he explained. "There's talk of sending you to Top Gun, possibly transitioning you to a test pilot program. Your performance has opened doors that usually take years to unlock." Sarah listened carefully, but part of her missed the simplicity of being just another pilot in the squadron. The tactical innovations she had used during the engagement were already being incorporated into training programs. Flight instructors were teaching her maneuvers to new pilots, and her decision-making process was being analyzed by military strategists. What had been pure instinct in the moment was being broken down into teachable techniques that could benefit future generations of fighter pilots. But the recognition came with unexpected challenges. Some veteran pilots resented the attention she was receiving, suggesting that luck had played a larger role than skill in her success. Others questioned whether she could repeat her performance under different circumstances. Sarah had gone from being underestimated to being scrutinized in ways that created new pressures. The most difficult aspect was dealing with the human cost of her actions. 6 enemy pilots had died that morning, and while they had been legitimate military targets, Sarah couldn't ignore the weight of those lives. She'd been trained to compartmentalize such feelings, but the reality of taking life in combat affected her more deeply than she had expected. A week after the engagement, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. General Patricia Hamilton, a 3-star general and one of the highest-ranking women in the Air Force, flew in specifically to meet with her. Hamilton had her own legendary status, having broken barriers throughout her career, and her visit drew attention from across the base. "I wanted to meet the pilot everyone's talking about," Hamilton said during their private meeting. "But more importantly, I wanted to talk to you about what comes next. Success like yours brings opportunities, but it also brings challenges that you might not be prepared for." Her words carried the weight of experience from someone who had navigated similar pressures. Hamilton explained that Sarah's achievement had made her a symbol for women in combat roles, whether she wanted that responsibility or not. "Your success proves what many of us have known for years," she said. "That competence has nothing to do with physical size or traditional stereotypes. But symbols come with burdens that purely tactical achievements don't carry." The conversation helped Sarah understand that her impact extended beyond military aviation. Young women considering military careers were already citing her example as inspiration. Engineering students were using her story to challenge assumptions about who belonged in technical fields. Her 20 minutes of combat had created ripple effects she was only beginning to understand. 2 weeks later, Sarah flew her first mission since the engagement. It was a routine training exercise, but everyone on the base watched her take off with intense interest. The pressure to perform was enormous, and Sarah felt the weight of expectations in ways she never had before. She was no longer just responsible for her own performance. She was carrying the hopes and doubts of everyone who had formed opinions about her abilities. The training mission went perfectly, but Sarah found it difficult to recapture the pure instinctive flying that had carried her through the combat engagement. Conscious awareness of being watched affected her decision-making in subtle ways. She was still an exceptional pilot, but the unconscious confidence that had made her extraordinary was now complicated by external pressures. During the post-flight debriefing, Rodriguez made an observation that helped put things in perspective. "You're still the same pilot who grew up flying crop dusters," he said. "Don't let the attention change who you are in the cockpit." The sky doesn't care about your reputation any more than it cared about your size. That evening, Sarah called her father back in Iowa. He had heard about her achievement through military channels but had waited for her to reach out first. "I'm proud of you," he said simply, "but I hope you remember that the best pilots are the ones who keep learning, regardless of what they've already accomplished." His words reminded Sarah that her greatest strength had always been her willingness to improve, to study, to prepare for situations others might take for granted. The recognition was gratifying, but it couldn't replace the fundamental dedication to excellence that had made her successful in the first place. As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that her real challenge wasn't living up to external expectations. It was maintaining the mindset that had allowed her to achieve something extraordinary, while staying humble enough to continue growing as a pilot and as a person. 6 months after the engagement that changed her life, Sarah stood before a class of new fighter pilot trainees at the Air Force Academy. She had been asked to share her experiences as part of their tactical training curriculum. Looking at the young faces before her, she saw the same mixture of confidence and uncertainty she had felt years earlier when she first entered pilot training. The promotion to captain had come through quickly, along with assignment to an elite training squadron, where she could share her knowledge with the next generation of fighter pilots. Sarah had initially resisted the posting, preferring to remain in operational units, but she eventually recognized the value of passing on lessons learned from real combat experience. "The most important thing I learned that day," she told the trainees, "wasn't about tactics or weapon systems. It was about trusting the training and instincts you've developed, especially when everything around you is happening faster than you can consciously process." The students listened intently, scribbling notes and asking detailed questions about decision-making under extreme pressure. Sarah had developed a teaching style that emphasized preparation and mental rehearsal over aggressive tactics. She knew that her success had come from years of studying and practice, not from natural aggression or risk-taking. Every hour you spend studying enemy tactics, every simulation you run through mentally, every technical manual you master completely adds to your chances of success when it matters most. The legend of her 20-minute engagement had grown over time, but Sarah was careful to provide realistic context for her students. She explained how fear and adrenaline had affected her performance, how luck had played a role in several key moments, and how the outcome could have been very different with small changes in timing or positioning. "People want to believe that success in combat comes from being fearless," she explained. "But the truth is that everyone feels fear. The difference is learning to function effectively while experiencing it. Your training has to be so thorough that you can perform correctly even when your conscious mind is overwhelmed by the situation." One of the female trainees asked about dealing with doubt from colleagues who questioned whether women belonged in fighter cockpits. Sarah's answer reflected months of thinking about her own experiences. "Let your performance speak for itself, but don't feel obligated to represent anyone but yourself. You're not responsible for proving that all women can fly fighters. You're only responsible for proving that you can." The training command had asked Sarah to develop new curriculum based on her combat experience. She worked with tactical analysts to create scenarios that emphasize the kind of intuitive decision-making that had been crucial to her success. The goal was to help students develop the ability to process multiple threats simultaneously while maintaining tactical flexibility. But the most valuable lesson Sarah taught couldn't be found in any manual. She emphasized the importance of maintaining humility regardless of success, of continuing to learn from every flight, and of understanding that confidence came from preparation rather than natural talent. The pilots who stop studying and practicing are the ones who eventually make fatal mistakes. 1 year after her famous engagement, Sarah received orders for her next assignment, test pilot school. It was an opportunity that typically came only after years of distinguished service, but her demonstrated ability to handle high-stress situations and think creatively under pressure made her an ideal candidate for evaluating new aircraft and weapon systems. The night before leaving for her new posting, Sarah walked out to the flight line where her original F-16 was parked. The aircraft had been retired from active service and converted to a training platform, but it still looked ready for combat. She thought about the morning that had changed everything, remembering the quiet nervousness she had felt before takeoff. Rodriguez, now a squadron commander himself, joined her on the flight line. "Any regrets about how things turned out?" he asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. The recognition had been gratifying, but it had also complicated her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. The simple love of flying that had motivated her since childhood now carried the weight of expectations and responsibilities. She never could have imagined. "I miss being underestimated sometimes," she admitted. There was freedom in having low expectations, but I wouldn't change what happened. That morning proved something important not just to other people but to myself. Sometimes you don't know what you're capable of until circumstances force you to find out. As Sarah prepared for her new chapter as a test pilot, she carried with her the lessons learned from 20 minutes that had revealed who she really was. The quiet farm girl who had grown up flying crop dusters had become one of the most respected pilots in the Air Force. But she never forgot that success came from preparation, dedication, and the willingness to trust her instincts when everything was on the line. Years later, when military historians wrote about the engagement, they would focus on the tactical innovations and strategic implications. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was personal. She had discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to perform excellently despite it. She had learned that true confidence came not from proving yourself to others, but from knowing you had prepared thoroughly for whatever challenges might arise. The farm girl from Iowa, who had been called bookworm by her squadron mates, had become something no one expected. Not just a combat ace, but a leader who understood that real strength often came disguised as quiet competence. She had shown that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who prepared in silence while others made noise about their abilities. As Sarah climbed into the cockpit of her new test aircraft for the first time, she felt the same calm focus that had carried her through that fateful morning. The sky was waiting, indifferent to reputation or expectations, caring only about skill and preparation. It was exactly where she belonged, and exactly who she had always been meant to become. The quiet pilot who had surprised everyone, including herself, was ready for whatever came next. The 20 minutes that had revealed her true nature were just the beginning of a career that would continue to break barriers and exceed expectations. But most importantly, she had learned to trust the instincts and training that had made her extraordinary, while never forgetting the humility that had allowed her to grow. In the end, Sarah Chen's story wasn't just about aerial combat or military achievement. It was about discovering that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who don't need to prove their strength until the moment when everything depends on it, and when that moment comes, they're ready.